War never changes.
Recalling the opening lines to the Fallout game series that reimagines a post-apocalyptic world after nuclear war, or as General Smedley Butler once wrote, "War is a racket," the former general challenging the very nature of war, declaring its purpose as only to the benefit of the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Or to look at the warnings first by George Washington about getting involved in other countries to the point that we forego our own, to Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address on the rise of an ever-growing military-industrial complex. Today, there are many ways we can look at it, and as we surpass the 16th anniversary of 9/11, we will come to realize that this global war on terror is still going on without an end in sight, expanding itself across 4 borders, launching drone strikes without the declaration of war, the buildup of proxy wars, and the most recent threat of nuclear war being put back onto the table. We can only begin to ask, how did we get here? To understand our most recent predicament of being in a never-ending war, we have to go back to September 11, 2001. It's been said before, but the events of 9/11 changed everything. Days following the 9/11 attacks, a bill was put through Congress, the Authorization of Use of Military Force. This gave unilateral authority to President Bush to declare war where he believed those terrorist groups connected to the attacks on 9/11 could be waged. It was passed through the House with a lone opposition vote, Democrat Representative Barbara Lee in California, whose impassioned speech on her fear of how this bill was a blank check and would lead us down a path of never-ending war. Her words fell on deaf ears as it passed through the Senate without a single opposing vote and was signed by the President. The Authorization Use of Military Force, also known as AUMF, continues to hold control over our current conflicts. The bill states, in general, that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbor such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future or international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. But to really understand how this rule changed how the U.S. declares war, we need to look at our original document, the Constitution. In the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 states, Congress has the right to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures of land on water. Article 2, Section 2 states, the President shall command-in-chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and of the militia of several states when called into actual service of the United States. As the American Progress wrote, the Constitution divides the power to declare war and the power to conduct war between the legislative and executive branches. Article 1 of the Constitution invests Congress with the authority to declare war and to raise and maintain military forces. Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the President as a commander-in-chief in the United States military and gives the office of authority to lead American military forces and prosecute armed conflicts. In this system, Congress decides whether to fight, and the President and Commander-in-Chief manages the fight authorized by Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution giving Congress the ability to vote and declare war was common practice all the way up until the Second World War. After that, the way of declaring war slowly began to change. Starting in 1950, as Andrew Bacevich wrote, President Harry Truman decided that a UN Secretary Council resolution provided sufficient warrant for him to order U.S. forces to fight in Korea. Congressional war powers took a hit from which they would never recover. But the act that started us towards this downward path of endless war was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964. The resolution, which was passed after the false flag operation claiming torpedo attacks against the U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, by 3 Vietnamese ships, was voted with near unanimity, allowing President Lyndon Johnson to take all the necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the United States and prevent further aggression. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution opened the doors for Johnson and later Nixon to expand the war from Vietnam into Cambodia and Laos, where 3 million people died, including more than 2 million civilians and 58,000 U.S. troops. With the misguided approach and the questionable acts that took place in Vietnam, along with the anti-war protests that arose with the demand to end the mistreatment of soldiers and acknowledge the war crimes being committed on civilians, Congress passed the War Power Act of 1973, also known as the War Powers Act. The act focuses its attention back to the original intent of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the authority to declare war, and Article Section 2, that allows the President commanding control of the military. The Act also reiterates that the President is required to the Act's second part, which requires, quote, the President to consult with Congress before introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent, and to continue such consultations as long as the U.S. Armed Forces remain in such situations, reporting requirements that the President must comply anytime he introduces U.S. Armed Forces into existing or imminent hostilities, and a second-day time limit on the use of U.S. force. This was a turning point for how war was to be declared, bringing the U.S. back on the path of what the Constitution originally called for, with the Congress voting on and the President leading wars, thus reducing the power of declaring war solely to the President.